So this is a lecture for Module 5. I'm going to do my best to keep it short, say a bit about Royce and Dewey, but I really want you to watch and enjoy and just be edified by Cornel West's lecture on Royce and William James and also the broader American pragmatist tradition, of which West himself is a representative and is sort of carrying that lineage, but he's also got critiques, and he wants to honor the genius of Royce and James and others, but make sure that we engage with their thought in the context of the tragic, of a tragic sense of existence and of the catastrophe of our time. This lecture by West was from, I think, 2007, and he was speaking to the ways that these ideas coming out of the American philosophical tradition need to be kept in close contact with and remain intimate with the problems of everyday life, particularly the problems faced by the downtrodden, the oppressed, the subjugated, the marginalized. And so, for West, he calls his remembering of and rewording of the pragmatist tradition, he calls prophetic pragmatism. So I'll let West speak for himself. He's perfectly capable of doing that, as you will see if you haven't heard him speak before. We're also reading his book, The American Evasion of Philosophy, of course. And he's a great writer, but as a rhetorician and an orator, and really it's like there's a preacher-like quality to the way that he engages with his audience and almost invites them to enter into a call and response. Though his audience was in this case full of professors who were perhaps a bit too formal and uptight to fully participate in such a performance. But let me say a bit about Josiah Royce and a bit about John Dewey. The readings, the excerpts from each of them that we read in the anthology American Philosophies, they're difficult. I think that they're short enough that hopefully you were able to make your way through it and gain something of interest. So I just briefly want to say that with Royce, he's an idealist philosopher influenced by German idealism, certainly, and Hegel. And Dewey also studied Hegel quite closely, but sort of moved away from that sense of idealistic philosophy into more of a form of action-oriented and experimental philosophy. And there's a dialectical tension, we might say, between Royce's approach and Dewey's approach, just as there's a tension between Royce and James. Royce and William James were quite close as friends, and they remained friends despite their fundamental philosophical disagreements. But for Royce, in this essay that we read on social consciousness and its relationship to self-consciousness, and the way that our idea of nature sort of arises as a result of the logic of the logic of how self-consciousness and social consciousness co-arise. So ultimately for Royce, objective nature isn't just a collection of pre-given physical entities out there in empty space that we as subjects then encounter sort of as individual subjects. We just come to know the objects out there through our senses, and we assemble some representation inside of our private minds about that collection of objects. For Royce, this way of looking at things negates first of all, it neglects, rather, the extent to which our own individual subjectivity is bound up in this network of mutuality with other people. And we can think of this developmentally or in terms of just everyday interaction between adult humans. But developmentally, a child comes out of its mother and begins entering into relationship by mimicking the facial expressions of its mother. And gradually, the infant internalizes this sense of being in relationship to others. So it begins as the relationship to the mother, gradually becomes a relationship to any other, and our capacity for inward self-reflection and self-consciousness grows in concert with the intricacy and complexity of our relationship to others, right? And for Royce, our shared attention in the intersubjective space that arises through the successful emergence of self-consciousness and social consciousness, the co-emergence of these, gives rise to an intersubjective space where we can come to agree with one another about how these natural entities that we observe, how they behave. We can come up even with statistical laws that describe that behavior, and we, as an intersubjective community of knowers, can reach an agreement that approaches something like objectivity about that world out there. But for Royce, he's not willing to say that objective world could even in principle exist independently from the community of subjects or the community of interpreters that is coming to know it. So there's a way in which Royce kind of, he's clearly an idealist, but he's almost verging on, he doesn't want to say that nature is just a sort of appearance or collective representation in human beings, because obviously human beings, we are ourselves physical organisms that evolved, and emerged out of nature. So he's not saying that nature is just a sort of appearance or intersubjective projection that we come to share in. He wants to say that there is some interiority or experiential interior to nature itself. And here he starts to become almost a panpsychist. And certainly panpsychism and idealism are intimately related. I hope that in reading Royce's essay here that you were sort of given an opportunity to think about the relationship between mind and nature in a new way. So then when we start to think about Royce's broader philosophical contributions, he doesn't mention God so much, or at all really, in this essay that we read, but God, or the absolute, was really important for Royce. As Cornel West will address a bit in his lecture, for Royce, this notion of the absolute or of the divine was almost a sense of the highest social self that we would be capable of imagining, the highest social consciousness, the most ideal form of social mind that we can imagine as human beings. That's the absolute. And because when we imagine this most ideal form of social consciousness, we're imagining a beloved community. We're imagining a community wherein love is the operative mode of relation, right? And that's the ideal that our historical communities made up of wounded, finite individuals, we fail to live up to this ideal. But nonetheless, we have these ideals to guide our collective action as we strive to realize or to approach something like a community of love or beloved community. And for Royce, the idea of the absolute, or the ideal of this highest social self that religious traditions call God, this ideal functions pragmatically to allow us to form society, to form communities, and to be loyal not only to one another in our finite communities, but to be loyal to the idea of loyalty itself, such that it becomes possible to translate between the ideals of of particular communities, to translate across communities by being loyal not just to one's own tribe, but to the idea of loyalty itself, loyalty to loyalty, so that we can then try to bridge a difference between our tribe and another tribe in our way of interpreting reality. So, when Royce talks about the absolute, he's not talking about something abstract that's beyond our ability to experience. He's talking about an ideal that can serve as a motive for action and a particular form of action, loving action. And so, Royce's so-called pragmatic, his pragmatic absolute is, I think, worthy of our consideration. Now, John Dewey is a more secular thinker, and I think the point I want you to take away from his work is the critique of a Cartesian epistemology that imagined the mind as something set apart from nature and imagined knowledge as primarily concerned with a sort of objective and certain description of or explanation for something that exists independent of our action or engagement with the world. So it's this sort of removed witness, a Cartesian ego that can just, through pure geometry, come to know and understand everything there is to know and understand. So for Dewey, in contrast to this Cartesian theory of knowledge, Dewey wants to affirm a pragmatic theory of knowledge. Knowledge, as always, bound up with action. Knowing is a form of engaging with and experimenting with our environments. And so we as organisms in environments come to know things not by being a mind that exists above the organic process, but rather mind for Dewey arises in concrete situations that organisms experience as problematic. So whenever we meet something unexpected in our experience, just as organisms navigating an environment, in response to that unexpected problem, mentation arises. And for Dewey, mental activity, is another form of action, but it's kind of like delayed action. And in this space of delay, action can be considered in the space of possibilities for action rather than just normal action. And so gradually this capacity to reflect on action, its reflection itself becomes a sort of action turned back upon itself. Gradually organisms develop this capacity into what we call intelligence. But for Dewey, even the most sophisticated forms of theoretical intelligence in human beings, and all of our science, it's emergent from and always coupled with certain laboratory situations and certain ways of being practically engaged with the world around us and with each other, right? So knowledge is something that we do. It's not something that we have. And so Dewey would say, we might think we have knowledge of something today, but the conditions are always changing. We are changing as organisms. The environment is changing. And so tomorrow when we engage the experiment again, it may be that knowledge, what it means to know that situation, has changed from what it was to know that a different situation yesterday. Because the point is, the situation has changed. History will always continue to unfold and require of us that we update our knowledge, right? So this is Dewey's emphasis on method, right? And experiment. And his school that he started with his wife, Miss Chapman, in Chicago, is now called, it's the laboratory school. And, he engages education itself as not a process of coming to know about a bunch of stuff, but education is learning the method of learning itself, so as to engage life itself as a process of inquiry, right? And to be educated is to know how to inquire, to have become methodological in one's inquiry, right? And thereby to have increased our capacity as organisms to successfully navigate an always changing environment. So that's where Dewey's coming from. You may have found his essay difficult, but you can see how he's critiquing the Cartesian epistemology. He's critiquing as well the mechanistic understanding of nature and bringing forth a more organic understanding of how mind and nature interrelate.